He thought they were just two old black men in a diner until they stood up and reminded the world what true heroes look like. It was a cold, clear morning when James put on his brown coat and placed his old Vietnam veteran cap on his head. Didn't rush. He took his time, as he always did every Saturday morning. He looked in the mirror, adjusted the cap carefully, and gave a slow, proud smile. Today was the day he met Clarence at their favorite diner. It had become a tradition for many years. They had started doing this after both retired, and neither of them ever missed it unless something serious came up. Clarence would already be there by now, probably sipping his coffee and chatting with Maria, the kind waitress who always saved their usual booth by the window. James stepped outside and took in the fresh air. The small town was quiet, and everything looked peaceful. He walked slowly down the street, nodding politely to neighbors and store owners. Some waved back, recognizing him not just as an old man in a veteran's hat, but as a man who had served his country with honor. Most people in town respected James and Clarence. They were quiet, humble men who didn't talk much about their pasts. But everyone knew they had been through things most people couldn't imagine. Inside the diner, Clarence was already sitting at their usual spot. His cane leaned against the wall, and his coat was folded neatly beside him. Maria brought over a cup of black coffee and gave him a warm smile. "Morning, Mr. Clarence," she said cheerfully. "James on his way." "Like clockwork." Clarence replied with a chuckle. That man could set a watch with his walking schedule. Not sure enough, just a few minutes later, the door opened and James stepped in. Da-da-da-da-da-da. He looked around, nodded to Maria, and walked over to the booth. Clarence smiled and raised his cup. "You're late?" James scoffed playfully. "By 30 seconds, your watch must be lying again." Maria brought over another cup of coffee and poured it for James. "Pancakes, bacon, scrambled eggs?" she asked, already knowing the answer. James and Clarence both nodded. "You know us too well," James said. The diner was quiet that morning. A few families were sitting at tables, and a young couple sat at the counter whispering to each other. Everyone was minding their own business. James and Clarence began talking about old times, sharing stories, and laughing in that way only old friends could, not loud, but deep and warm, the kind of laughter that came from knowing someone for half a lifetime. But then the bell above the diner door rang again. A young police officer stepped in. He was new in town, Officer Clay. He had transferred from a big city recently and had a reputation for being too quick to act and too slow to listen. Some townspeople had already had a few uncomfortable run-ins with him. He'd walked in like he was looking for trouble, scanning every table with sharp, suspicious eyes. He stood tall, walked with purpose, and gave off the kind of energy that made people nervous even when they hadn't done anything wrong. He looked around the diner and paused when he saw James and Clarence. His eyes narrowed just slightly. Maybe it was the hats. Maybe it was the color of their skin. Maybe it was just his own prejudice. He walked slowly toward their booth. James noticed him first. Didn't say anything, but his body tensed slightly. Clarence looked up and followed James's gaze. They had seen this kind of look before. Not just in their youth, but even as older men. That quiet kind of judgment that didn't need words. They'd dealt with this attitude before in different uniforms in different towns. In different times, Officer Clay stopped in front of their table and looked down at them like he was inspecting something suspicious IDs. He said firmly. James blinked, unsure if he had heard right. "Excuse me?" "I said I need to see some identification," Officer Clay repeated. "You two have been sitting here for a while. We've had reports of suspicious individuals loitering." Clarence raised an eyebrow. "We're eating breakfast," he said. Plainly, like we do every week. "Don't get smart with me," the officer snapped. "I'm just doing my job." Maria, standing behind the counter, heard the exchange and hurried over. "Officer," she said carefully, "these men are regulars. They've been coming here every Saturday for years. They're veterans." Clay didn't look at her. "Ma'am, this is police business. I'll handle it." James slowly reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his wallet. He placed it on the table, not handing it over, but just placing it there. "You want to check my ID? It's fine. But maybe ask yourself why you're doing this first. "'Cause I have a right to check if someone's causing problems," the officer said. "You two were speaking loudly. Might have made some customers uncomfortable." Clarence gave a short laugh. "We were talking about a dog we saw on the way here." A quiet tension filled the diner. The young couple at the counter stopped whispering. A father with 2 children leaned in closer to his wife. Maria looked at the officer with disbelief. "They're not causing trouble," she said again. "They're good men." But Officer Clay was already moving his hand closer to his belt, not drawing anything, but giving a silent message. Authority, power. James looked up, his voice still calm but firmer now. "We wore these hats because we earned them. We served this country long before you were born. Don't think we're going to sit here and be disrespected." The officer didn't respond. He seemed unsure now, but his pride wouldn't let him step back. He glanced around and saw people staring at him, not with support, but with disapproval. Even the cook in the kitchen had stopped what he was doing and was watching with narrowed eyes. Clarence slowly stood, using his cane. He wasn't a tall man, and age had taken a toll on his back and legs. But there was something in his eyes that made the diner feel colder. "You know," Clarence said quietly, "we were once in a diner like this in Alabama in 1963. Back then, the men harassing us were different uniforms. But the way they looked at us, that hasn't changed much." James stood beside him. "Just like back then, we'll stand with dignity." "You go ahead, officer. Call backup. Write a report. Do whatever makes you feel like a man, but you won't find anything wrong here." 4. The first time, Officer Clay hesitated. He looked around again. Every eye in the diner was watching him. Nobody looked afraid of James or Clarence, but plenty looked angry at him. He shifted uncomfortably. Maria stepped forward. "You should leave them alone." But before anything more could be said, a man in a gray suit from a nearby table slowly rose to his feet. He had been quiet the whole time, eating his breakfast, watching, listening. Now he reached into his coat and pulled out a small leather badge holder. "Officer Clay," the man said, his voice cool and steady. "My name is Major Daniel Keating, Army, and I suggest you step away from these men. Right now." Everyone froze. Clay turned and looked at the man, suddenly less sure of himself. "These men are not your suspects," Major Keating continued. "They are decorated veterans. You owe them not just your respect, but your apology." There was a long silence. You could hear the coffee dripping behind the counter. James and Clarence stood side by side. They didn't need to say a word. The look on their faces said everything, calm, proud, and unshaken. Officer Clay said nothing. He looked like a man who had just realized he walked into the wrong moment. He gave one last look at the 2 veterans, then turned and walked quickly out of the diner. As the door shut behind him, the silence broke. People began to speak, softly at first, then louder. Maria rushed to the table. "I'm so sorry." She said, "I can't believe that just happened." James gave her a soft smile. "It's not the first time. Won't be the last. But thank you." Clarence sat back down and sighed. "Now can we please get our pancakes?" The entire diner burst into soft laughter. The tension melted like snow in sunlight. Maria wiped her eyes and went back to the kitchen. Major Keating sat down quietly, returning to his meal. But something had changed in the diner. A lesson had been taught, not by force, but by quiet strength. The mood in the diner was still a little tense, even after Officer Clay walked out. Some people went back to eating their breakfast, but many were still whispering about what just happened. James and Clarence didn't talk about it at first. They just looked at each other, exchanged a small nod, and picked up their forks. But inside, both of them were feeling something. Not anger exactly, not fear. It was something deeper, a mix of sadness, disappointment, and exhaustion. It wasn't the first time they'd been treated like that. They both knew it wouldn't be the last. James took a bite of his pancakes and looked out the window. The sky was bright now, and a few people were walking by. Life was moving forward as it always did. But what just happened stayed in the air like a storm that had passed through and left everything wet and heavy. Clarence slowly took a sip of his coffee. His hands were shaking slightly, not from fear, but from age. Still, his eyes were sharp. You'd think after all these years, they'd look at us and see something more than just our skin, he said quietly. James nodded. But they don't. They just see what they want to see. Maria came by with refills of coffee, but her smile was gone. Her hands were tied around the pot, and her voice had lost its usual cheer. I'm sorry again, she said.
Oh, he's
New? He doesn't know you. He didn't want to know us, Clarence said. That's the difference. She looked like she wanted to cry, and for a second, she leaned down and gently placed her hand on Clarence's shoulder. I'm glad you stood your ground, she said softly. You were right, too. James smiled at her. You always take care of us. Just then, the diner door opened again. Everyone turned their heads, expecting maybe the officer to come back. But it wasn't him. It was someone else, a man in uniform. I had a police uniform, but a military one. A tall man in a sharp suit with a clean haircut was Major Keating. He had finished his meal earlier and left quietly, but now he had returned. This time with a serious look on his face. He walked straight up to the veterans' table and gave them a sharp, respectful salute. James and Clarence both looked surprised, but they slowly nodded and returned the salute. Gentlemen, Major Keating said, I just got off the phone with someone from the Attorney General's office. That officer crossed a line. Clarence raised an eyebrow. Called the state? Yes, sir, Keating said. Didn't ask for help, but I felt it was my duty to report it. What happened here wasn't just rude, it was wrong, and it won't be ignored. James sighed. We've filed complaints before. They disappear. Keating sat down across from them and leaned forward. Not this time. That young man at the counter recorded the whole thing. It's already being shared online. Clarence looked over at the young man who gave them a thumbs up. People are talking, Keating continued. And they're not talking about the officer. They're talking about you. Your calm, your dignity, your strength. You made a bigger impact than you realize. James looked down at his coffee. We weren't trying to be heroes. We were just trying to eat breakfast. Sometimes, Keating said. Being a hero means standing still and not letting someone push you down. Just then, the bell on. The door rang again. But it wasn't the officer or anyone in uniform. It was a reporter. A woman with a notepad, camera around her neck, and a curious look in her eyes. She had heard about what happened and came to find out more. Behind her was a cameraman. Maria walked up to them. Can I help you? I heard something happened here this morning, the reporter said. We're with Channel 7. We're just hoping to speak to the two gentlemen involved. Clarence and James looked at each other. Neither of them liked attention. They'd spent most of their lives keeping their heads down, doing their work and not asking for praise. But something was different this time. Maybe it was the way that officer looked at them like they didn't belong in their own country. Maybe it was the look on Maria's face when she tried to stand up for them. Maybe it was the tiredness they felt from carrying this kind of treatment for decades. Clarence nodded once. Right, but only if it's honest. No twisting our words.
right.
Reporter agreed and sat down across from them with her pen ready. The cameraman stayed back, respectful and quiet. What happened here today? She asked gently. James looked into her eyes. What happened here today is what's been happening to us for most of our lives. Only difference is, someone finally saw it, Clarence added, and someone finally stood with us. They spoke softly, carefully. They didn't raise their voices. They didn't make speeches. They just told the truth about how they had served in Vietnam, how they had faced racism when they returned home, and how even now, as elderly men who had given everything for their country, they still weren't safe from suspicion. The reporter was moved. She thanked them and promised to share their story with respect. As she left, other customers came over, one by one. Some shook their hands. Some said, thank you. A mother brought her young son over and told him, these men are heroes. The boy looked up at them with wide eyes. James bent down slowly and asked, you like history? The boy nodded. Then, remember this, James said. Real history doesn't just happen in books. It happens when people do the right thing, even when it's hard. Clarence smiled. And it happens when people stand together. More people came into the diner. That morning, Some had heard about what happened and wanted to meet the veterans. Others just came for breakfast but left feeling like they had witnessed something important. Outside, someone had placed a small American flag near the window of the diner. Others began adding notes, little messages like "Thank you" and "We stand with you." James and Clarence stayed a little longer than usual that day. Coffee grew cold, but their hearts felt warm. It was strange. They had come just for a simple meal, but they had ended up reminding a whole town what respect looked like before leaving. Major Keating returned to their table one last time. "I've seen men face war, face fear, face death. But the courage you showed this morning?" He paused. "That's the kind of strength this country needs more of." James patted his shoulder. "We didn't do anything special. We just didn't let hate sit at our table." Clarence stood, gripping his cane. "You can't control how people treat you, but you can control how you respond. And we responded the only way we know how, with honor." They slowly walked out of the diner together, side by side, as they always had. The streets were quiet again, but something had changed. Not just in the town, but in the hearts of the people who had witnessed it. They didn't say much on the way home. They didn't need to. After all, they were two soldiers who had fought on many battlefields, but perhaps the most important battle they ever faced happened right there at a breakfast booth. Pancakes, coffee, and quiet dignity. As Clarence and James stepped out of the diner that day, the sun was shining, but something heavy still hung in the air. The calm smiles they wore on their faces were the kind of smiles older men often wore when they had lived through worse. They weren't smiling because they were happy. They were smiling because they had survived yet another moment of injustice with dignity. It was something they had both learned over decades of being treated unfairly, something they had grown used to but never numb to. They walked slowly down the street side by side without speaking. It was a quiet walk they had made hundreds of times before, after breakfast. But this time, every step felt different. Behind them, the diner was still, buzzing. People were talking about what had happened. A few were still outside, talking about the cop, the confrontation, and the way James and Clarence had handled it all. No one had expected that a peaceful breakfast could turn into something so powerful. What the two veterans didn't know was that everything had been captured on a smartphone. A young man at the counter, no older than 20, had quietly recorded the entire event from the moment. Officer Clay stepped toward their table to the moment Major Keating stood up and confronted him. The young man, named Elias, uploaded the video to his social media page with the caption, "Two black veterans harassed by cop at local diner. Then this happened." Within minutes, the video was being shared across town. Within an hour, it had reached neighboring cities. By nightfall, it had spread across the country. People were outraged. People were moved. Some cried watching the calm bravery of Clarence and James. Others cheered when Major Keating spoke up and demanded justice. Strangers who had never met either of the veterans began writing messages of support and love. "This is what real strength looks like. Respect our elders. Heroes don't wear capes. They wear veteran hats and eat pancakes." Meanwhile, back at the police department, Officer Clay was sitting in his office, unaware that the internet had just turned him into a national headline. When he finally looked at his phone, his face turned pale. The messages were pouring in. People were tagging his name, calling him out. The department's phone lines were blowing up. Citizens, veterans, journalists, and even soldiers from out of state were calling to ask what would be done about the incident. The police chief, a man who had served in the same town for 30 years, was furious. He hadn't known much about Officer Clay when he transferred in. The officer's record had been mostly clean, with a few complaints buried in the files. But this wasn't something they could ignore. The chief called Clay into his office, and the conversation was short. "You've been suspended," the chief said sternly, "until further notice." "For what?" Clay asked, trying to act confused. "I was just doing my job." The chief held up his phone and pressed play. There it was, his voice, demanding IDs from two elderly black men peacefully eating breakfast. The way he spoke, the tone, the way he ignored Maria and even threatened to reach for his weapon. "Doing your job?" the chief repeated. You embarrassed this department. You disrespected men who wore the uniform long before you ever did. This is not policing. This is prejudice." Clay didn't respond. Couldn't. The chief made another call, this time to the town's mayor. The story had already reached City Hall. People were protesting outside. Signs had been placed in front of the station. "Respect our vets. No justice. No peace. Clarence and James matter." The mayor, trying to control the situation, arranged for a public press conference. They wanted to calm the public, and more importantly, they wanted to make sure the truth was told clearly. But Clarence and James had not asked for any of this. They hadn't called the news, or asked for protests, or even tried to push for punishment. All they wanted was to be treated like human beings. But sometimes, one moment changes everything even when you don't ask for it. That evening, Major Keating paid them a visit. He knocked on Clarence's door, and when it opened, he stood straight and said, "Gentlemen, I wanted to thank you again for how you handled today." James welcomed him inside, and the three sat down at the small kitchen table. A few photos of their families and military days hanging on the walls around them. "Didn't expect it to go viral," Keating said. "I just knew what I saw wasn't right." Clarence poured him a cup of tea and said, "That's the difference, son. You saw, and you said something. Most just looked the other way." Keating looked down for a moment and then said, "Well, the story's out now, and it's moving people. Veterans from around the country are reaching out. People want to hear from you, want to stand with you." James shook his head slowly. "We're not looking to be famous." Keating nodded. "I understand. But whether you wanted it or not, people are listening now. Maybe this is the moment the country needs to remember who we're supposed to be." By the next day, local and national news crews were parked outside the diner. Maria had to close early because of the crowds. Clarence and James became the center of attention, not for doing anything flashy, but for doing something timeless, standing up for their dignity. Letters started arriving at their homes. Dozens at first, then hundreds, schools wrote. Churches wrote. Veterans organizations offered awards, speaking invitations, and lifetime memberships. A retired general even called and asked to meet them in person. One letter stood out. It came from a young black boy in Atlanta. He wrote, "Dear Mr. James and Mr. Clarence, I saw your video with my mom. I'm only 11, but I want to be brave. Like you when I grow up. Thank you for being strong. You're my heroes." Clarence read that letter 3 times. Then he folded it neatly and placed it in his top drawer with his war medals. At the town hall, the mayor held the press conference. He apologized publicly to the veterans and promised new training for the police department. He said, "Let this be a reminder to all of us. Service, sacrifice, and honor come in many colors. We must respect them all." Officer Clay didn't appear. He was being investigated not just for this incident, but for complaints from his previous station. It was likely he wouldn't wear the badge again. Clarence and James agreed to do one short interview. Just one. They didn't want to be on every screen, but they understood this story wasn't just about them anymore. It had become something bigger. In the interview, the reporter asked, "What would you like people to learn from what happened at the diner?" James answered, "We want people to slow down before they judge. Look at someone and ask yourself what story they carry before you assume the worst." Clarence added, "And speak up. When you see something wrong, speak. Don't wait." Silence. "Helps no one," the reporter asked. "What did it feel like when that officer stood over your table?" Clarence took a moment, then said, "Like all the years we wore this country's uniform didn't mean anything. Like we were invisible again, but we weren't. Not that day." That interview touched hearts all over the world. It was replayed on news stations, shared online, and even used in training programs for young police officers. At the diner, Maria made a change. She placed 2 plaques above their usual booth. One said, "James, Vietnam veteran, fighter for freedom." The other said, "Clarence, Vietnam veteran, defender of dignity." Above both was a wooden sign carved by a local artist. "Heroes eat here," and people came. They didn't just come for breakfast. They came to thank the 2 men who reminded them what courage really looks like. One Saturday morning, a group of students came in with their teacher. They sat near the veterans' booth, wide-eyed. The teacher whispered to Maria, They asked to come here after seeing the video. They wanted to meet them. Maria smiled and said, "They'll be here. In 10 minutes? Never misses Saturday." Sure enough, the bell rang. James and Clarence walked in, hats on, steps steady. The students stood and clapped quietly. James looked surprised. Clarence looked shy. But they smiled, waved, and walked to their booth. That morning, instead of just sharing stories between themselves, they invited the students over. James told them about his first day in the army. Clarence told them about the friends he lost in Vietnam. And then they both talked about what happened at the diner. Sometimes, James said, you fight battles without bullets. And sometimes, Clarence added, you win them by not backing down. The kids listened closely. They weren't learning from a textbook. They were learning from living history. Outside the diner, someone had painted a mural on the side. While it showed two old men sitting at a booth, quietly drinking coffee. Behind them, in faded colors, were two young soldiers in uniform, James and Clarence as they once were. Above them, the words, "Honor lives here." And so, a quiet morning at a small-town diner had become something unforgettable, not because of who shouted the loudest, but because two old men chose to stay seated, stay calm, and stay strong. And in doing so, they taught an entire country what respect truly means. The moment the video of the confrontation at the diner went viral, everything changed overnight for James and Clarence. What had started as a quiet morning routine to elderly black veterans meeting for breakfast suddenly became a national conversation about respect, justice, and the legacy of those who serve. The video showed everything clearly: Officer Clay's harsh and disrespectful behavior, the calm dignity of the two men, and Major Keating's firm stand. People all over the country saw it, and their reactions were immediate and powerful. News crews from all over rushed to the small town. Reporters wanted interviews, politicians made public statements, and social media exploded with messages of support for the veterans. James and Clarence had never sought attention, but now their story was everywhere.
Ow.
They woke up to find their phones filled with messages from strangers thanking them for standing up with courage.
Ow.
Community centers and veterans organizations. Others simply sent words of encouragement, sharing their own stories of facing prejudice and hardship. Despite all the attention, the men remained humble. They were not looking for fame or reward. They wanted only what they had always wanted: to be treated with the dignity and respect every human being deserves. Yet the spotlight on their experience brought new challenges, as well as new opportunities. The town itself was deeply affected. People who had known James and Clarence for years now saw them in a new light, not just as friendly faces at the diner, but as symbols of resilience and grace under pressure. The local police chief held a meeting with officers to address the incident. He apologized publicly and promised to review department policies to prevent such harassment from happening again. Officer Clay was suspended pending a formal investigation, signaling that the town was taking the matter seriously. Veterans groups across the country sent letters and gifts. They praised James and Clarence for their bravery, not just on the battlefield decades ago, but in that small diner where courage took a different form. Invitations poured in for the men to attend ceremonies, honoring their military service and their recent stand against injustice. Some even offered to pay for medical care or home improvements, wanting to give back in any way they could. One of the most touching moments came when a group of local school children prepared a surprise for James and Clarence. They had learned about the veteran's story and decided to create a thank you banner with drawings and messages of appreciation. When the children arrived at the diner, they presented the banner with shy smiles and a round of applause. The veterans, usually quiet and reserved, were visibly moved. James' eyes glistened with tears as he thanked the children, and Clarence gave a rare, warm laugh. Amid all the public attention, James and Clarence also had to navigate personal feelings. For years they had carried the burden of discrimination, silently focusing on their families and their quiet lives. Now, suddenly, their story was public, and they had to relive painful memories and face difficult questions. But instead of retreating, they chose to use their platform to educate others. They spoke openly about the struggles they had faced after returning from war through racism, the isolation, and the fights to reclaim their dignity. Their message was simple but powerful. Respect and equality are not just ideals, but rights that must be fought for every day. They encouraged younger generations to stand up against injustice, to support one another, and to never let history's painful lessons be forgotten. As the days passed, the diner where the incident took place became a place of pilgrimage, and visitors came not just for the food, but to meet James and Clarence, to hear their stories, and to honor their courage. Maria, the waitress, put up a special sign near their usual booth that read, "Heroes Eat Here." It became a symbol of the community's renewed commitment to respect and inclusion. Meanwhile, Officer Clay's situation worsened. The police department's investigation revealed multiple complaints about his behavior. The town's leaders faced pressure to take stronger action, and it became clear that Clay's approach was out of place in the community. Eventually, he was reassigned and required to undergo extensive training on diversity, de-escalation, and community relations. Though the veterans accepted the apology Clay eventually offered, they did so cautiously. Their trust had been shaken, but their hope for change remained strong. They believed that this incident, painful as it was, could lead to real progress. The impact of the diner incident reached far beyond the small town. Police departments across the state began reviewing their own policies. Training programs incorporated the video as a case study, emphasizing the importance of respect and the dangers of bias. The story inspired conversations in schools, churches, and workplaces about how communities could better support veterans and combat systemic racism. James and Clarence found themselves speaking at events, sometimes reluctantly, but always with honesty and conviction. They shared lessons from their past and hopes for a future where no one would be judged by the color of their skin or the clothes they wore, but by the content of their character. Their friendship deepened as they faced this new chapter together. It reminded each other of the strength that had carried them through war and hardship, and they took comfort in knowing that their quiet stand in the diner had sparked a movement much bigger than themselves. At the end of the day, James and Clarence were not just veterans of war, they had become veterans of justice and dignity, teaching a whole nation that respect is earned through kindness, courage, and standing firm in the face of unfairness. Their story showed that sometimes the simplest act, sharing a meal, standing your ground, can shine a light on the darkest problems and inspire real change. After the storm of attention and emotion settled, life for James and Clarence began to change in ways they had never expected. What started as a simple breakfast tradition had turned into a powerful story that inspired people all over the country. The two men, once quiet veterans living their peaceful lives, had become symbols of courage, dignity, and the ongoing fight for respect. Every week, people came to the diner, not just to eat, but to see James and Clarence. Children with bright eyes and questions approached them with curiosity. Veterans, young and old, shook their hands with gratitude. Local leaders invited them to speak at schools and events, eager to hear their stories of war, peace, and standing. Tall in the face of injustice, James and Clarence embraced their new roles with quiet grace. They didn't seek attention, but they accepted it because they knew it could help others. They wanted to use their voices to teach, to heal, and to bring people together. Their messages were always clear and simple. Respect all people. Stand firm when wronged. Remember that everyone deserves dignity. At school assemblies, James would tell students about his early days in the Army, the fear, the bravery, the friendships. Clarence shared stories of his time in Vietnam, about the friends he lost and the lessons he learned. But most importantly, they talked about what happened in the diner, the moment when two old men were challenged, and how they chose to respond with strength and honor. The students listened, wide-eyed, absorbing every word. They learned about history, not from books, but from living proof of resilience. Some asked tough questions. Others shared their own experiences with unfairness or bullying. James and Clarence encouraged them to speak up and support each other, teaching that true bravery comes from kindness and standing together, churches, and community centers invited the veterans to speak about unity and healing. Many events ended with standing ovations, tears, and heartfelt thanks. The story of the diner incident became a symbol of hope, a reminder that even in difficult times, people can come together to fight hate with love and respect. Back at the diner, Maria had made a special corner just for James and Clarence. It had photos, medals, and letters from supporters. Above their booth hung a wooden sign carved by a local artist, "Heroes Eat Here." The sign was a daily reminder to the community of what true heroism looked like, not just on battlefields, but in everyday life. One Saturday, a group of young people from a nearby college came to meet the veterans. They had been inspired by the story and wanted to learn how to create change in their own communities. James and Clarence spoke to them for hours, sharing advice about courage, patience, and never giving up. Meanwhile, Officer Clay's life had changed drastically. The police department's investigation had concluded, and he was no longer on patrol duty. Instead, he was assigned desk work and required to take sensitivity training. Public opinion was harsh, and many called for him to lose his badge entirely. Although he eventually issued a public apology to James and Clarence, many in the community remained wary of trusting him again. James and Clarence accepted the apology with cautious hearts. They knew true change takes time. Forgiveness was part of their journey, but it didn't mean forgetting or ignoring what happened. They hoped that Officer Clay's experience would be a lesson not just for him, but for all who held power too. Use it with respect and humility. Their story did not end there. Police training programs across the state began using the diner incident as a teaching example, highlighting the importance of respecting every citizen and the damage that prejudice causes. Schools used the video to spark discussions about racism, history, and kindness. More than that, the story inspired everyday people. Neighbors started new conversations about how to support veterans and minority communities. Community leaders worked to create programs that brought people together, celebrating diversity and fostering understanding. James and Clarence remained close friends, leaning on each other through every new experience. They often reflected on the strange journey they had taken from simple breakfasts to becoming teachers of courage and respect. They understood that their fight was part of a larger one, stretching back through history and still going forward. They kept visiting the diner every Saturday, surrounded by friends, family, and strangers who had become friends too. Each time they sat down, the moment reminded them of the power of quiet strength, the power to change hearts and minds without raising a fist or a voice. One evening after a speaking event, James looked at Clarence and said, "You know, I never imagined our little breakfasts would mean so much." Clarence smiled and replied, "Sometimes the smallest things teach the biggest lessons." They knew their legacy wasn't about fame or awards. It was about standing tall when it mattered most, showing kindness in the face of cruelty, and teaching the next generation to do the same. And so, two black veterans who had faced war overseas found a new mission at home, to be living examples of honor, courage, and respect in a world still learning those lessons. Their story reminded everyone that heroes aren't just those who fight in battle. They're also those who stand up for what's right every single day.